Okay, here we go again. Climate change today, session 4 in conservation ecology this semester. I hope you're all hanging in there okay. So let's talk about the next main threat to biodiversity. We've talked so far about trends in biodiversity globally. We've talked about major changes in land use and how this influences habitat, and habitat loss being one of the main drivers of loss of species. We've also talked about connectivity and that being an additional major threat to species. And today let's talk about the next major threatening process, which is due to become more serious in the future still, and that's climate change. So we'll talk a bit about climate change basics today and think through some of the effects that climate change can have on populations, species, and species interactions. We talk a tiny bit about synergies between climate change and other human activities, look at implications for conservation, a very, very short note on the complexity of conservation governance in the light of climate change, and then I summarize at the end. So we looked at this before, and I highlighted to you that climate change was one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss after land use change, and that in some kinds of systems, remember in boreal systems, for example, or in high mountaintop areas, climate change can even be the primary driver of biodiversity loss already. And of course, we know that climate change is predicted to exacerbate in the future, so it's an important one to look at. Back in 2005, I was part of a literature review that looked at the main threatening processes investigated by conservation biologists. At the time, habitat fragmentation and habitat change were studied a lot, and climate change was a relatively minor thing. If we have a look at what's happened in the pattern of habitat fragmentation and climate change in the literature since then, here's 2005, then we see that it was sort of in this particular search term combination, habitat fragmentation and climate change were kind of up against one another, and then climate change just exploded as a major research field in conservation. There are essentially three challenges we need to understand when it comes to climate change at the moment. First, we have a rise in greenhouse gas emissions thanks to the combustion of fossil fuels from 1990 to 2015, for example. We see the pattern here, including some of the fluctuations, but generally there's a very strong upwards trend in CO2 emissions. When we look at the balance of sources of carbon and sinks of carbon, then what we're finding is that there is a major mismatch in the sources and sinks. So essentially, the total estimated sources do not match the total estimated sinks. And we don't really understand what's happening here at the moment, but essentially what's happening, so that means that models are still imperfect because some carbon seems to be getting lost right now. But essentially, what you see here is this widening. So more and more fossil fuels are being burned, and most of this ends up somewhere, and the blue stuff is the atmosphere. So most of it ends up in the atmosphere. We don't fully know exactly why they don't match 100%, but essentially most of it ends up in the atmosphere. When we look at the atmosphere then, for example, this is the most famous long-term observation, the so-called Keeling curve from Hawaii, and there you can see that you essentially have steady increase in the amount of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. So essentially three factors here combine. Carbon is being burnt, CO2 is being emitted as a process, ends up in the atmosphere increasingly and can be measured as a rise in CO2 concentration. What's happening there is that we have incoming solar radiation, some of which is radiated back from the surface into the atmosphere, and some of that radiation is then, some of that sort of longer wave radiation is re-emitted back to the surface and is basically trapped by greenhouse gases to make the surface of the Earth warmer than it would otherwise be. So we need the greenhouse effect, and if we didn't have it, it would be very cold, but we don't need it to the extent that we have it now. There are various different greenhouse gases. The most important ones to think about are probably carbon dioxide, methane, and some of these others here. So that's, in a nutshell, the greenhouse effect. Just very simply summarized. I'm sure you're getting a much better summary of how this works in biophysical terms in some other classes rather than this one, since I'm not exactly a climate change expert. We have, as a result, seen climate warming of almost 1 degree over approximately a century. I think the latest numbers are just under 1 degree over the time period shown here of global climate warming on average. So that's happening so far, and the trends are predicted for that to continue. So how is this influencing populations and species? Well, the first thing we note is that the life cycles of organisms are marked by regular biological events, and we call that the phenology. So, for example, there's a certain time when birds lay their eggs, or there's a certain time when a tree starts to have buds, or a certain time when, and so on. I mean, so it goes. Basically, all these things have sort of annual cycles. And what's been happening is that a lot of these events for different species shown here, so each one of these bars is an individual species, a lot of these events happen earlier and earlier in spring. So 0 would be same as always, whereas a minus would be, say, -5, which means 5 days earlier. So for lots of species, a certain onset in breeding events, for example, and so on, is happening earlier than it used to. So spring's coming earlier for many species, basically. For birds, this is visible. For butterflies, it's visible. For herbs and grasses, for vegetation, that means trees and shrubs also. And I'm afraid that I'm in the way here of this last category of organisms, sorry. So things are happening at different times than they were happening in the past. The other thing that's happening is that species are starting to shift their position in the environment. If we just look at the left to start with, we see data from a long-term study in the United Kingdom looking at the speckled wood, that's this butterfly here, and the speckled wood was monitored for a very long time, and then there were also historical records for this species. And we can see that the species early in the 20th century, in the first half of the 20th century, say, was found mostly in the south. Then in 1940 to 1969 was found further north already, and in the period 1970 to 1997 was found further north still. So this species has been spreading northward into the United Kingdom. Similarly, they also looked at different combinations of other species, so grasshoppers, butterflies, beetles, spiders, and looked at if there was no shift, the observed shift and the predicted shift according to a certain model. And basically, if there was no shift, then this should be peaking here, the distribution. But for many of these species, what we're finding is that the actual data suggests that indeed there have been latitudinal shifts in these species. So if we do this in the northern hemisphere, in temperate climates especially, then typically what we're seeing is a northward shift of the ranges. If you study this in the southern hemisphere, obviously, it's a different story. And of course, we know that climate change changes biodiversity patterns. Apologies for that. You might feel the same depending on when you're watching this. So we know that climate change influences species because, of course, in the past, different plant species, say, were distributed in different places from where they are now. If we look at the last glacial maximum between maybe 13,000 and 25,000 years ago, then what we're finding is that certain kinds of vegetation associations, like tropical moist forest or desert or temperate broadleaf forest, whatever, different kinds of things were located in different places. So, for example, this this yellow band here is southern steppe tundra, and that was here all the way in well, like central to southern Europe. We had southern steppe tundra, and just north of that we had polar desert. So now we still have some southern steppe tundra somewhere, but well, actually, it doesn't actually exist anymore now. But well, you can definitely see it, that for certain, you can see it more easily for some things than for others. But this whole story of Europe being dominated by temperate broadleaf forest basically wasn't the case then, because there was ice in the way. So obviously vegetation has shifted in massive ways as a result of climate change in the past, so we can expect that this will happen again in the future. So we've looked at latitudinal changes now in species distribution, but there are also altitudinal changes. So altitudinal changes means that as they try to track the climate that they find suitable, species are moving up the slopes. Say in the case of mountains, they're moving uphill to track the climate that is still cool enough for them to survive. As a result, what we're finding in many environments, such as the boreal to temperate zone, there are more and more species coming into mountaintops. So each of these points here is a mountaintop, and mountaintops are actually gaining species. So species are pushing up towards mountaintops from the surrounding environment, trying to get to this cooler climate that is suitable for them. In the Mediterranean mountaintops, that's the red ones, here you get negative numbers. You have a change in species numbers that's negative, meaning you're losing species here, and that is because those are under water stress, and because of water stress you're actually not getting the same effect as in the other places. But typically then species are trying to move upslope to track the climate. So this kind of concept of basically species tracking climate is obvious in a way. We know from the past that certain megafauna went extinct as a result of the end of the last ice age. We know that other species did better as a result of climate change. So climate change will always bring with it changes in the populations and species. What's happening at the moment, the problem is that the rate of change is very, very fast, and that's and of course human induced. But those are essentially the things that are problematic at the moment. So one question we can ask is, can species actually keep up with the changes that they need to go through? And I actually think that one of the Ice Age movies, I think, kind of picked up this theme of whether they could keep up with climate change in a slightly less scientific way. So different organisms obviously can move at different rates. So imagine if you are a split-hoofed mammal, like this moose, I think it's a moose, then you can move a long way. You can move a long way quite easily. So kilometers per decade is what's shown on the y-axis here. So you can probably manage to move 90 kilometers in a decade if you have to because of climate change. So even the worst sort of climate change prediction at the moment means that, well, you can outrun that, assuming there's sufficient habitat in between, by the way, and we get to that, but basically no problem. If on the other hand you are a tree that reproduces very slowly, perhaps takes a long time for a tree to grow, and perhaps doesn't move its seeds very far from the source tree, then it takes a very long time for you to move your whole population to somewhere else. You can basically not really keep up. And we're seeing that effect already, that lots and lots of tree species are having trouble growing as productively, or as in forestry as productively, or as well in ecological terms in the locations where they used to grow well. Small plants are similarly in trouble. Smaller mammals and primates also don't move nearly as well as, say, carnivores or these hoofed animals. Plant-feeding insects, there doesn't seem to be a lot of data in this particular one because there's Maybe they just looked at one species, not sure what's happening there. And freshwater mollusks also not so great. So depending on what species you are, you're going to have a hard time keeping up with climate change. Okay, this shows a few different things in terms of the traits of a species that make it more or less vulnerable to extinction in the context of climate change. So endemic species, those that occur nowhere else but in a particular location, endemic species seem to be at greater threat of extinction under this modeling study than non-endemic species. Certain taxa appear to be at particular risk. For example, amphibians are at a particularly high risk of extinction from climate change compared to these other organisms, birds, plants, fish, mammals, invertebrates, reptiles. And we get to one of the reasons why amphibians are hard hit in a moment. Dispersal also makes a difference. So how you disperse, and that's what we talked about in the context of connectivity, and now just in the previous slide with the question of can they keep up. So depending on your body size, your mobility is going to be different depending on how you move. So if you're a wind dispersed tree, you're not going to throw your seed very far away from your parent tree. That's a very different story from if you're a moose. So this sort of dispersal strategy basically makes a difference. The ones with no good dispersal strategy whatsoever are at the highest risk of extinction. So extinctions are trait dependent, and then there are projected climate driven extinctions, and depending on the scenario you look at, many or not so many species might be going extinct as a result of that. But generally speaking, we can be sure that it is an increasingly difficult threat. So we have talked about how species shift in time and in space and up the latitudinal gradients as well as up mountaintops. And of course, they don't all do this in exactly the same way. And what that means is that we're also having problems in changes in the interactions between species. So what used to look like a certain community that occurs in a place now is being reshuffled. And perhaps new species are coming in, or perhaps the same species are there, but the timing of things is slightly different from how it used to be. So we have a look at that a little bit. Competitive interactions, mismatches in species, and diseases are the three things that I briefly want to pick up here. So competitive interactions, one nice example is that the red fox is pushing northwards into the range of the Arctic fox. The Arctic fox there is often outcompeted and is trying to sort of shift its range to basically track suitable climate and get away from the red fox. So you have changes in the competitive interactions as the snow melt is different, and because of the climate being different, the red fox has an easier time here than the Arctic fox. So that's one example of changes in competitive interactions. We also have rather complicated interactions across whole trophic systems. So let me take you through this in approximately, that is, and then we won't try to get every single point on these diagrams. But basically, there's the phenomenon of bud burst when trees have their buds. Then there are caterpillars as a result that can feed on these leaves. Then there are insectivorous birds that feed on things like those caterpillars. And then there are raptors that feed on things like birds. So the timing in all of these is changing through time because of the different onset of spring. Things happen earlier and earlier, as we saw before. So the caterpillar peak date, let's ignore this picture actually. We'll just look at these ones, these trends here. So this is a non-significant trend downwards. Downwards means earlier and earlier from 1985 to 2005. So slightly earlier trend for bud bursts, so earlier buds. Stronger trend for caterpillars. So caterpillars seem to be coming in earlier and earlier and earlier through time. many different species of birds respond to this and also go on earlier and earlier, but the slope here is sometimes flatter than what we saw here. And this raptor in turn is not yet showing these kinds of changes in its phenology. So we have potential mismatches that organisms change their timing based on certain clues in the environment, but they're not necessarily able to adjust all exactly in the same way. And there might even be new species coming into an environment as well. So as a result of that, there can now be mismatches in the ecological community where before everything fit together quite nicely. Now quite rapidly there are changes with this rapid climate change happening, and as a result there can be a mismatch. So it's possible, for example, that birds like raptors at the top of the food chain maybe will not find the food sources at some point that they used to find, or at different times and so on, and then there might be periods of shortage if there are mismatches in the timing. So this study mainly didn't show a mismatch so much, but just showed that things are shifting somewhat together, but indeed this guy is not part of it, and this also didn't appear to be part of it. So a bit unsure exactly how these kinds of things will play out in the future. Biotic interactions also change with disease. This here is the golden toad, which is a species that used to be abundant in Costa Rica, in a very small area, but still that was very abundant. But then it was hit by a disease called the chytrid fungus. The chytrid fungus is the main threatening process to amphibians around the world. It is a fungus that infects the skin of amphibians, and as a result, well, some can recover, but there's also a high rate of mortality, and this is basically wiping out amphibians around the world right now. We look a bit at threatened species in a future class, and there with a couple more slides on that. So the challenge here is that under certain conditions that are, say, slightly warmer, this fungal disease, chytrid fungus, can basically flourish more so than under slightly colder conditions. So the combination of climate change and this disease being present can make this disease more dangerous, which is already a big threat for species. So that's another type of change biotic interaction as a result of climate change. So we looked a bit at changes in competitive interactions. We looked a bit at matches and mismatches of species. And at diseases, there are also changes in predator-prey interactions and pollination interactions, which you can imagine in the context of this mismatched species. So depending on which species is where, that will change things. But I haven't got examples of those now. Climate change doesn't happen on its own, but rather it interacts with lots of other human changes. So lots of human activities at the same time put a stress on ecosystems. And that's really the key problem of our times, that we have all this landscape change going on at the same time as now rapid climate change. So for example, we have mangroves where they are being hit from the sea because of sea level rise, but then from inland there's also pressure there, and as a result then through time you may lose your narrow fringe of mangrove forests at the edge of oceans. So that's one of the examples where you have combinations. Another example is of course that there's also human migration in response to climate change. So people are moving around the world, sometimes tracking to more suitable climates. So while in principle certain climates might become more suitable for certain kinds of biodiversity, if at the same time you have a mass influx of people to those areas because they were basically being displaced from some other location because of unsuitable conditions, because for example increasing droughts or whatever, then that also poses additional stress on land somewhere. So human responses to climate change in terms of land use changes and also human migration, which then leads to different land uses in different places, interact with climate change and will influence biodiversity, especially in Africa where we have a lot of human population growth. projected still for this century, we can expect that drought-driven human migration, will cause changes in where humans use land and how they use the land there. So that will interact with the effects of climate change per se. We will talk a bit more about protected areas in a future class, but very briefly, let's look at the left to start with. If you have a situation where right now your species occurs here, then in the future, maybe you're putting a reserve there, very nice, but then the species is maybe shifting its range because of climate change and it's moving northwards, then suddenly your protected area that was meant to protect a certain species is actually outside the range of the species. So this can happen in theory. This is an extreme case, of course, but it just goes to show that as you're planning protected areas, which are spatially set in a location, if there's climate change and the ranges of species shift, and maybe they shift in different ways for species A, B, and C here. So maybe species A won't experience the same kind of shift as species B or species C, and actually there's a bit of the picture missing here, and I'm sorry about that. But you can imagine that these would shift somewhat northwards, but in slightly different ways. Right now, all three species are captured by reserves, but if they all shift northwards a bit, you can imagine that maybe this species A will still be in reserve 1, species B will not be captured anymore anywhere, and species C also, even though it's in both reserves right now, might not be in any anymore in the future, so that the only thing you've got is a little bit of species A protected. So the idea that we have static conservation tools, and in fact the term conservation implies a certain level of something being preserved, the static concept really doesn't match very well with the reality that everything's shifting, especially in the context of climate change. That's a major challenge for conservation. It's actually a major, I would almost say, philosophical challenge for conservation, because the whole notion of conserving something is to somehow maintain it. How can you maintain things in times when there's rapid change? That's actually a very deep question, and if you have a whole discipline based on the idea of maintaining something, then that's an interesting challenge. So if you think of presence-absence in some locations for species that need to track climate change through time, then you can get to these situations where you can model, well, can species move through the landscape if the connectivity is good enough, and maybe through time you can check that there are sort of ways how they can make it to here, to this location where they can still exist. But there are also other examples, maybe where species like here, maybe they couldn't make it from here to here to here. So are there stepping stones? Is there enough connectivity for these theoretical range shifts that we know species are trying to adjust their ranges in order to keep up with climate change? But is this actually possible? And that's the interaction here between connectivity, which we talked about in the last class, and climate change. Obviously, you need to have connections in the landscape that are working for the target species in order to enable this movement that theoretically might take place depending on the mobility of the species. So strong interaction here between connectivity and climate change. When faced with such uncertainty, you see lots of terms like climate smart around everywhere now. One of the ideas is to use active adaptive management, it's sometimes called. So adaptive management basically says, let's do something, but as we're doing it, we're monitoring what we're doing. And then as we're monitoring it, we're seeing whether it works, and then we're going to adjust what we're doing as a result of that. So you might plan some objectives and assess climate impacts and vulnerabilities and revise your conservation goals, and you reassess your vulnerability as needed. Then you have adaptation options, you look at certain actions and you implement them. You then track whether they were working, that's the monitoring part. You adjust your actions as needed, and then you keep doing that. So you have sort of little internal cycles here of reassessing vulnerability as new science emerges and adjusting actions as new evidence emerges that certain things aren't working, all embedded within a larger cycle of conservation planning. So this sort of active adaptive management can be helpful potentially to deal with the question of how can we actually do conservation at a time of huge uncertainty because of climate change. Not all landscapes are going to be threatened in the same way. This slide has an awful lot of text on it, so let's try to simplify it a little bit. We have two axes. This y-axis is the landscape conservation capacity. So if it's low protected areas, poor connectivity, and a degraded matrix, you're here. If it's a high percentage protected area, high connectivity, and an undegraded matrix, you're up here. So clearly it's easy to get through this kind of landscape. It's really tough for species to get through this kind of landscape. We talked about connectivity in the last class. Landscape vulnerability is on this hand, because this is a little hand symbol. On this axis, if you have topographic variability and low climate change velocity, then you're here. So there's lots of mountains, which means you don't have to move very far to get to a very different climate. You can just move. So basically moving like 100 meters up is like moving much further north, right? So in terms of or let's say 1 kilometer up is more like 10 kilometers north or something like that in terms of, or even more than that actually, in terms of tracking the same climate. On the other hand, here you're in a situation where you have rapid climate change and are topographically unvaried. So there's no way, you have to have latitudinal shifts. Then depending on which of these kinds of quadrants you're in, you have different conservation actions. You're either resilient or you're somewhat resistant. Maybe you're particularly sensitive in this case, or you're susceptible. And then depending on what's happening, you need to do different kinds of strategies in order to cope with the challenge of climate change. So you might expand protected areas and improve connectivity, especially in these kinds of environments. Or you focus on maintaining connectivity and matrix permeability in these kinds of cases here. And yeah, depending on where you are, you're going to have slightly different management priorities. We talk mainly about terrestrial ecosystems because I understand a little bit about them, and I really don't understand very much about marine systems. But just to mention that, of course, climate change is really hitting high levels of marine biodiversity in various situations as well, such as in coral reefs. We have ocean acidification resulting from enrichment of CO2 in the atmosphere. And as a result of this ocean acidification, we have major problems to things like coral reefs. Also, marine protected areas work in a very different way from sort of protected areas on land, and sometimes there are whole areas that are outside national jurisdiction. So 2/3 of the Earth's surface is actually covered by oceans and 1/3 only by land. So the focus of this class is on terrestrial systems because I, like many other human beings, have this bias towards terrestrial systems. But actually, most of the action is probably in the ocean, or a lot of the action is in the ocean. That's where life also started, as we talked about. So quite important to keep in mind that this climate change problem isn't only threatening terrestrial systems, but also marine systems. It's been termed a wicked problem. A wicked problem is a phrase that entered sustainability discourses some decades ago. Actually, a wicked problem is one that's sort of both ill-defined and really difficult to see how you could ever solve it. We have urgency. We need a solution right now. But we don't really have a clear governance arrangement at this international level for how this can work. And as a result of that, we keep delaying and delaying and delaying action on climate change. Now, I'm sure you're getting proper exposure to governance of climate change in other classes rather than this one, such as working with Jens Nevik, for example. So I'm really only just touching on it as a sort of as a pathetic little amateur here. Obviously, the global stage is important because the places where the climate change problems occur are not necessarily those with the largest effect. So, for example, a lot of the emissions come from Europe, North America, and so on, but a lot of the effects will be felt, amongst other things, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. So we have these inequities in the world, like we have for many problems, that also play out in the context of climate change. We clearly need to reduce carbon sources and increase carbon sinks, but how, where, and when remains a question. Obviously, there is a very long history of recognizing that climate change is a problem, and it's quite, well, I think frightening that we have known about this issue of climate change through studies by, for example, NASA and so on, for a very long time. A very long time meaning real climate change gurus have known or have basically warned of climate change in the 1980s. So in 1988, it was already the establishment of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and since then there have been massive breakthroughs on the science of climate change, but the actual policies have very much lagged behind as a result of this global coordination challenge. So we're basically having a major problem globally to get the coordination we need to abate climate change, with the result that we have, in many of the IPCC reports, tracked the worst case scenario of climate change. And we're still, I think, probably not doing much better right now. Yeah, species will get lost. So this figure was meant to be animated, but because I didn't manage to have my little video down the corner here and the animation of the PowerPoint presentation, apologies for that, because I didn't manage, you kind of can't really see this slide. It basically tells you that over the years we are going to be losing increasing proportions of species. Depending on what scenario of climate change we're tracking, it's going to be terrible, that's the red line, or it's going to be just awful, that's the blue line. One way or the other, it's not going to be very good. Climate change will have a major effect on species in the long term. Figures show the proportion of species losing 50% of their range, so many species will lose huge amounts of their ranges in the future. Now you could say, okay, but surely species are also gaining ranges, right? Because they can move to places. But basically, on average, it turns out that climate change is happening so fast that species are largely going to be losing their ranges rather than gaining ranges as a result of climate change. Most species are losing from climate change. Oh, and I'll add, just like most species are losing from human-induced landscape change and land covers, we talked about the fact that there too you always have a few winner species, so that's going to be true for climate change as well, but mostly you're going to have species that are losing. So some of the research challenges in the context of climate change relate to the idea that we need to link what's happening locally with these global models. New information needs to be taken into account. The synergistic challenges between multiple types of threat need to be understood better. So modeling climate change in isolation is fine, and we know it's a big threat, but it is going to be interacting with all these other social ecological changes that are taking place. And that's really a challenge. I would even say it's not clear to me that predicting all this is necessarily the right scientific response. It might be more finding ways of how we can understand or how we can deal with major uncertainty. Our predictions are going to be wrong, basically. Whatever the world will be in 10 years from now, or 20 from now, or 30 from now, it'll not be what we think right now it'll be in 10 or 20 or 30 years. So I think predictions are likely not necessarily the best tool here, but rather other ways of looking at how do we deal with extreme uncertainty, building resilience perhaps. Many species are involved, so how these interactions change is also important. And so it's time to move beyond range shift and analyses, which we've done many of, and instead sort of really look at how will complex biotic interactions change as a result. Essentially, it's a matter of reducing the stressors on our world, the biophysical stressors in red, the social stressors in yellow. Basically, the social ones come from within the world, the biophysical from outside the world in this particular picture, whatever. But the story is that we need to then kind of start adjusting our ways. If we go this way and we notice, oh, that wasn't so good, we need to decide again and then try to get there, try to get somewhere better. So we're going to get it wrong. And this is a sort of decision pathway diagram. The idea here is that we're going to get it wrong, but then when we realize we better get it right, and then we check again, did we get it right? Where do we go next? And so we can find ways to get to okay-ish sort of outcomes in basically by looking again and again at what's the state of our biophysical and social stressors, and how can we get to a world that takes the stress away, less yellow, less red stress. So high resilience world, low risk, that's where we want to be. So that's one way of thinking about it. These are sort of adaptive pathways about the future, where you check again and again and again, are we tracking right? What's happening at the moment is probably that we're going like this, we're saying, oh, we're not tracking right, we still haven't done anything about climate change, and then we go here and go, oh, we're still not going right. We're still not doing anything about climate change, and then we're going here. So that's what's happening at the moment. The suggestion would, of course, be to kind of actually do things differently when we notice that we haven't gone the right way. But doing that in this international governance context is very challenging. That's for a governance class, however. So, climate change is possibly the greatest long-term threat to biodiversity because it changes species ranges and also lots of interactions between species. It can increase ecosystem degradation, and there are lots and lots and lots of unknowns here in terms of species interactions and so on and so forth, how interactions with land use change, human migration, whatever. So ecosystems are both affected by climate change, but they also affect climate change because they are carbon sinks. For example, forests are carbon sinks. So in a future class on restoration, we manage tree planting. Tree planting is one of the things that people do in order to increase the amount of carbon sinks, for example. So ecosystems play this vital role in climate change, both because they're affected, but also because they influence climate change per se. It seems that we sort of need more adaptive ways of dealing with protected areas and dealing with connectivity in the landscape. Themes of habitat and connectivity that we've touched on in the last two classes already. And there really is a challenge then for how to maintain species and their movement outside protected areas, because at the moment only about 15% of land is in protected areas. So clearly we need to start to think about what we do with the rest of the land. That's it from me for today on the major threatening process of climate change. We'll visit another threatening process next week, and until then I'll say goodbye, see you on Zoom, bye bye.